Hello. Recently I uploaded a recording of our first IPC moot back in our pub venue after the lockdown, which was a discussion, sort of talk slash discussion of Carl Jung's notion of the shadow archetype and how that can be understood from a pagan perspective. And a couple of people who viewed that recording asked a few questions and said, oh, there were some bits that weren't very clear, could I go over them again? So this is a sort of slightly more detailed version of kind of the same thing, but expanding into some angles and areas that weren't covered in that moot talk, and trying to answer some of the questions that people have put to me by email and Facebook and one thing and another. So if I start with a bit of a brief recap for people who haven't seen the other video to kind of give you the gist of what it was about. The Swiss psychologist Carl Jung, who was writing quite extensively in the first half and partly into the second half of the 20th century, built on ideas from Sigmund Freud. Now, Freud said we have an unconscious mind. There's the conscious bit, the part of me that's awake and talking to you at the moment, and the part of you that, well, hopefully is awake and listening to this talk. That's the conscious mind, but that is only a small part of who we are. Freud said the greater part of us is unconscious. It's the sort of sleeping self, full of memories and experiences that the conscious mind has largely forgotten or lost access to. Whereas the conscious mind talks in language and rationality, the unconscious mind talks in imagery and dreams and emotions and feeling and music, and in a very kind of abstract, symbolic way. Carl Jung agreed with all of that, but where he parted company with Freud, well, several points he parted company, but one of the points he parted company was with this idea that as well as my individual unconscious and your individual unconscious and everybody else's individual unconscious, all of these unconsciouses merge together to form a collective unconscious. And so, as an image I've chucked out in other podcasts in the past, if you imagine the collective unconsciousness as the sea, the ocean, and we are like icebergs floating in the ocean, we are composed of the same stuff as the ocean is. We're all water, except our water, as it were, for the icebergs, is fixed in place. We are, well, we look to the casual glance solid. Now, we know that icebergs in reality, just to carry the analogy a bit further, in reality are in a state of flux because bits of them melt and they break off and they dissolve into the ocean. And when it gets really cold, more ice forms around. So an iceberg is never completely static for any great period of time because it's constantly shrinking in one part but growing in other parts. And it's moving and changing as well as floating about and sort of moving geographically, as it were, covering a distance over time. So what looks solid when you just look at and glance at an iceberg as you're going past on a ship actually isn't quite as fixed and rigid and solid as it seems. And the same can be said of human beings, that I feel quite solid at the moment. Just had a cheese scone, I feel quite solid. But I'm not. I am changing over time. And whereas the iceberg lumps of ice fall off and dissolve, and more ice is formed, in a kind of analogous way, ideas from my head fall out of my head, as it were, like now when I'm talking to you, or if I'm writing something down and communicating with people in whatever sort of a circumstance it might be, that bits of me go into the collective and they float around and other people pick them up. So just as water molecules from iceberg A can become part of iceberg B, C, D and E, so ideas from one person can float across and become part of another person because they take on board those ideas, maybe enthusiastically. They think, yes, brilliant idea, I agree with that. And it becomes part of their life and part of their identity. Or in a negative way, somebody does something shitty and horrible to you, or they're really rude and vile to you. but you fail to follow the advice of Buddha of leaving the anger with the individual, you take it on board, and you feel hurt by it and wounded by it and got at by it, and you walk around for days, weeks, months, years, feeling damaged by what that person has said to you or done to you, or what have you. So it can be both good ideas, positive ideas, but also unpleasantness goes from person A to person B. So just as I transmit things that are in my head to other people, so other people transmit things that are in their head to me. So it's this kind of like the water, bits of ice breaking off, dissolving, re-emerging. It's this constant moving tide between icebergs. So whilst I feel solid and I feel separate, I do not feel as if I am sharing a mind with the family who live next door. I've got no idea what they think about and talk about. So I don't feel like there is an obvious connection, but we are all ultimately of the same substance, and our minds, even though the people next door actually speak a totally different language to the one I speak, nonetheless our kind of consciousnesses will at some very subtle level shift and merge and touch upon each other. And of course in this day and age we have the internet and social media and what have you. So now more than at any point in human history, I as an individual can have a far bigger impact than I probably could have done 100 years ago, 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, as can you. In that we can all sit here and we can, whether typing some gibberish on Facebook or we're making very wise and profound statements through blogs or vlogs or whatever the hell we're up to, we can get our ideas across in ways that would have been impossible 1,000 years ago. 1,000 years ago, you could have put your idea across to the somebody down at the pub, at the village inn, maybe had an influence on a dozen, 2 dozen people at most. But unless you were a lord and or a lady, a king or a queen, an archbishop, unless you were one of the great and the good, your capacity to influence large numbers of people was very, very limited. Hardly any chance to do so at all. Whereas these days you can be a clueless plonker and still have a huge influence on people. Indeed, think of a lot of these people who describe themselves as social media influencers. Half of them don't seem to have 3 brain cells to rub together, but they have tremendous impact on many, many lives. And even though they're not, or at least when they started, they weren't famous. When they started, they weren't rich. Maybe they become so over time, but they don't need great wealth and influence and social status to impact vast numbers of people. So the whole kind of dynamic of how we interact today in the 21st century compared to, say, people in the 11th century, for argument's sake, is utterly transformed, utterly different because of social media. It's opened up the sea of the collective unconscious in a wholly different way. And what has any of this to do with a shadow? Wandering off topic quite dramatically, but so come back to that. So Jung argues that as well as us, you and I and anyone else out there, being icebergs floating in the sea of the collective unconscious, there are also these vast forces. And as we're going with this kind of nautical flavour of imagery, let's compare them to tides in the ocean. Tides that can move 1 iceberg, 20 icebergs, 1,000 icebergs to the east, to the north, to the west, to the south. Tides that can shift, and maybe tides that move so subtly. Sometimes those icebergs have no idea they're being moved. They are moving, they're being influenced by these hidden tides, but that sometimes they may not be aware it's happening. There are other times when they are very aware it's happening. And so the archetypes are these vast collective experiences that move huge numbers of people like tides in an ocean, moving the fish, moving the icebergs, moving the boats on the surface and the rest of it, and pushing this way and that. These archetypes are composed, to an extent, of shared experiences on key themes. So to use an example I've used several times before in other podcasts, we use a variation when I talk about the Great Mother. Let's go for fatherhood this time, just to be ever so slightly different. There are, Lord knows how many billions of men over the course of human history who have been fathers. They have been biological fathers, in other words, they've fathered a child with a woman, or social fathers, so they may not be biologically connected, they may be stepfathers, they may be adoptive fathers, foster fathers, that sort of thing. So they may not have the direct biological connection to the child, but they raise the child as theirs. They are, to all realistic intents and purposes, the father of the child, in a social sense, if not necessarily in a genetic, biological sense. And so fatherhood is a shared experience. Some fathers are lovely and kind and caring and cuddly, and some are fierce and strict and scare the life out of their children, and some are just vile and do awful, appalling things to children, and some are neglectful and hardly pay any attention to their children at all. So you get a whole range of good, bad, and ugly fathers all over the place. And the experience of each man who is a father is an addition to the archetype of the great father. And the experience of every child who has a father, or remembers having a father, if their father's died or gone to war or something, and they haven't seen their father in a long time, but they still have memories of him. So every child who has memory or direct present time experience of a father contributes to that collective archetype, and it builds up and it builds up. And just as there are the kind of vast universal element of the Great Father, every culture on Earth at the moment, maybe if we went back into the vast distant past before people had quite the same grasp of biology they do today, maybe people wouldn't have had quite the same notion of fatherhood, possibly, stretching it a bit, I think there, but possibly. But for the cultures on Earth at the moment, we understand the idea of fatherhood. So there's the vast perception, there's also the culturally specific perception. So you might say, in this culture, in this period of history, in this culture, people think a good father should behave in so-and-so way. Whereas in that period of history, in that culture over there, they think a good father should behave in this slightly different way. And so you could have the idea of the archetypal French father compared to the archetypal Japanese father might be different, because there's cultural expectations in Japan as to what is a good father, and there's cultural expectations in France as to what is a good father, and equally expectations as to what is a bad father. And so people grow up in those cultures and they absorb their cultural flavour, and they have an idea of what is good fathering and bad fathering and so forth, and whether they themselves are living up to it. If they're a man, are they living up to the standards of fatherhood? Or if they're a child and they're looking at their father and they're thinking, well, do you measure up to the standards of what culture tells me fathers should be like? Which is, what do we mean by culture? Well, that's the neighbours. Compare you to the fathers of my friends at school and how they behave, or at least how I'm told they behave. Let's put it like that. So how do you measure up to other fathers I've known? But also dads on TV, dads in storybooks, dads in films. So we have the kind of collective fictionalized representation of fathers, and children compare the real thing to the fictional version. Sometimes finding them a bit wanting, but also maybe sometimes being really pleased that their father is so much better than the version they've seen in some work of fiction, or indeed from the stories they might have heard from other kids at school, and think, my God, your father's awful, mine's 10 times better than yours. So there's all those sorts of experiences that layer and layer and layer over time. And if you think going back generation after generation after generation, all of those layers of fatherhood build up and build up and build up, and that creates this tide, this archetype, this force within the collective ocean of their consciousness, which steers both men who are fathers or expecting to be fathers at some point soon, but also children who have an understanding of what their father's like. Wives who think, is my husband a good father or not? Their understanding of what a father should be. So all of these people influenced by that archetype of the great father. And some people have very good experiences of their father, some people have very bad experiences, and that colours their perception of what fathers are like, and colours their perceptions of notions of things like patriarchy. Is it a good thing or a bad thing? Well, that's influenced by their experience of whether fathers are a good thing or a bad thing, and all sorts of other factors come into play. But again, what's that got to do with the shadow? So that's an example of a archetype, a fairly easy to grasp archetype. The shadow is something that Freud advanced as an idea, and Jung ran with, and again parted company with Freud as to having slightly different ideas as to how he saw the shadow operating and how Freud saw it. Now, Freud's idea initially was that we consist of three main elements. It's a bit more to it than this, but three main elements. The ego, the conscious mind, the bit of me talking to you now, that has a sense of self. When I look in the mirror, go, oh, that's me. I recognise my face in the mirror. That is me recognising my ego, my sense of self, my sense of I. The comedian Joyce Grenfell, you have to be of a certain age to know who Joyce Grenfell is. She has this little anecdote thing she tells, in which she was had a friend who was Joyce Grenfell was a Christian Scientist, and she had a friend in the same church. Who the friend was walking down the street one day thinking about shopping or whatever it was she was thinking about, and she suddenly realised she'd walked straight past someone she knew and cut them dead, and she thought, oh, how rude of me, how awful, this poor woman, I just ignored her. And so she ran back a couple of yards to go and apologise to this woman, say, sorry, I wasn't intending to ignore you, I was just lost in thought. And when she arrived back at the spot where she passed this old woman she vaguely knew from somewhere, she realised she'd seen her own reflection mirrored in the glass of the window of a shop. The peculiar old woman she vaguely knew from somewhere was herself. So you could argue sometimes our sense of I, of who I am, is stronger than it is at other times, and there's points where it gets all a bit vague and you kind of think, who the hell am I actually? Even to the point maybe of sometimes not quite recognising yourself when you see photographs or reflections in mirrors or what have you. That's the ego, or ego, if you prefer to be a bit more Latin. The superego, or superego, if you prefer, is your moral conscience, which we acquire from our parents going, you mustn't do that, dear, but equally saying, you really ought to go and do that. So it's partly a voice that says, no, don't, but it's also partly a voice that says, yes, you ought to. You ought to go and do that. That's the right thing to do. And so we acquire this moral conscience, and most of us do. Psychopaths and people who end up becoming serial killers and politicians and what have you, obviously struggle with that one. Don't necessarily have a particularly strong conscience, but most of us have one. The other part of ourselves is the part we're born with, according to Freud, which is the id, the dark side. So before the infant, the newborn baby, develops an ego, before it develops a superego, it is pure, raw, undifferentiated id. And the id is instinct. It's instinctual urges. The urge to sleep when you're tired, to eat when you're hungry, to pee everywhere when you need to pee everywhere, to scream and shout when you are feeling frustrated or cranky or whatever. It's that kind of huge roaring impulsiveness that all babies have, where they don't hold back on anything. Now, it's all well and good for someone who's 3 months old to not hold back on anything. But clearly, if you had a 35-year-old who shit themselves every time they needed to go to the toilet or threw things to the window every time they were in a bad mood, then it would get a bit nightmarish as a society. It'd be very difficult to handle. So parents need to teach the child to rein it in. Teach the child that they can't have every single thing they want the instant they want it. That when you need to go to the toilet, you have to kind of cross your legs until you can find a toilet to go to, not just pee yourself when you're standing there. That just because somebody upsets you doesn't mean you can punch them in the face. We learn to restrain the id. At least most of us learn to restrain the id. Clearly some people struggle with that one. And so the id is really the shadow side, the dark side. It's the difficult, awkward, not very socially acceptable bit of you that is there always. And somebody's talking to you and you're thinking to yourself, oh, shut the hell up, you moron. But you don't necessarily say it because you know it's antisocial. So it's still there, but it is a restrained element of you. So that darkness is within. There's a little bit more to it than just that in the Freudian sense, because it also incorporates the notion of the thanatos, the death drive, the urge to destroy yourself and to destroy things and to destroy other people. But that's a slightly separate issue. So Freud and Jung agreed on that for quite a while, that there was this dark impulse in the self, which is destructive and antisocial and unpleasant to be around when it's unleashed, and that most of the time we have to keep it bottled up. But that when you can indulge it, that can be pleasant in itself. If you've been keeping your legs crossed, desperately trying to find a toilet for quite a while, and you finally, try not to be too graphic, you finally find the loo and you go and you think, oh, that sense of relief. There is a satisfaction in doing what your body needs to do and not having to worry about anyone else, because either you're somewhere private or whatever, and you can just follow your body's instincts and not give a damn anymore. When you have those moments, they are quite pleasant moments. I think it's Japanese factories have, well, some of them, I don't know all of them, but some Japanese factories apparently have a little room in the basement with a figure made out of cloth and stuffed with straw, like a kind of scarecrow type thing. And there's a photocopy of the face of the boss pinned to the head, and it's like the kind of thing that's used in martial arts to practice taekwondo and what have you. And so workers who are feeling really frustrated and fed up with the boss can go into this room, shut the door, and knock 7 shades out of the figurine, the mannequin, with a stick. And when they feel better, they can close the door and go back up, and no one sort of asks awkward questions. And it's understood that this is a much better safety valve to go and knock 15 shades out of a mannequin than it is to pick up a spanner and knock 15 shades out of the boss and end up in prison. So it's a recognition that anger, rage, fury is a very central pertinent emotion, and if it's not channeled safely, it becomes destructive. And so the way to manage, you could say a better way would be not to drive your staff insane in the first place, but a way to manage a society, whether it's a business or a family or a religious group or a school or whatever that it might be, is to say people will have these dark emotions. We know they're going to have them. How do we get them to relieve themselves, as it were, to have a safety valve, to let off steam, and so those destructive impulses will not rip the organisation apart or result in that worker going home and drinking themselves to oblivion on cheap vodka. Rather, they can release it in a way that is controlled and safe. And is that something that maybe organisations in this country, compared to Japan, struggle with? We just pretend it's not there. We do the very British blinkered thing and pretend stuff isn't happening, rather than saying, well, we know people are going to get infuriated. How can we help them release their fury without needing to punch somebody's teeth down the back of their throat? Something to think about. So where Jung and Freud parted company on the matter of the shadow, the id. Partly it was the archetypal idea, but the shadow itself is an archetype, one of these great tides in the current of the collective ocean. But also the idea that Jung introduced, that the dark side, the shadow, isn't only all those impulsive, instinctual things, hunger, rage, tiredness, lust, all of that. It's also anything you are taught to be ashamed of. And that, depending on your family, on your culture, on your circumstance, could include a whole raft of things. All sorts of things could be included under the list of things that the people around you think you should be ashamed of and keep hidden. So at one level, you could say different cultures have a different notion as to embarrassing body parts. So in some tribes around the world, you could walk down the street, if you're a woman, topless, and no one would blink an eye because all the women are topless. Whereas obviously, if you were in Britain, that's a bit cold, really, isn't it? But if you were in Britain a warm day and you walk down the high street with your boobs out, then a few eyebrows would be raised because people expect that part of your anatomy to be covered up. And so you get the way some people don't quite know what to do if a woman starts breastfeeding in a public place. Do they look away? Do they stare in the opposite direction? Do they just get up and move? So they don't. What do they do? Because that is a part of the body that we're told, by and large, women shouldn't be showing in public. And if you should catch a glimpse, if you're a man or a woman, lesbian, bisexual, whatever, you're not really meant to just sit there staring at a woman's breasts. It's not considered socially polite to do that. In other parts of the world, the soles of the feet are considered a bit rude, so you wouldn't show your bare foot, or the sole of your bare foot at any rate, to someone. You wouldn't sit there with your feet up and your bare feet pointing at someone, because that would be considered rude. Whereas over here, obviously in Britain, if you did that, no one would give it a second thought, because it's just the sole of your foot, and that's not seen as in any sense rude or something to be hidden. So that's a very light level. What should you hide in a culture? Every culture has ideas that there are certain things you don't do in public. That could be bits of your body you don't show in public. It could be, if anyone's been to France, and you need to go to the loo, I'm a bit obsessed with toilets. You go to the loo, and you've got a pissoir in the street. What kind of cover, if you've never seen one, they're sort of got like a metal thing around them, but you can see the head of the, well, depending on how tall they are, of course, you can see the head of the person over the top of the metal sheet. They're stood there having a pee. You can't actually see them peeing because the metal screen is in the way, but you can hear it. You can see their head peeking over the top of the metal barrier. It's a very odd experience if you're used to a culture like Britain, where if you go to the toilet, you don't expect other people to be able to see you go into the toilet. If it's like I suppose if you're in a gents, in a pub or something, obviously you've got the urinals, you might have several men stood next to each other, but you don't expect members of the general public to be able to look through the window and see you whilst you're having a pee. So again, what should you do in public, what shouldn't you do in public, varies by culture and by family. So two families living next door to each other on the same street might have somewhat different views as to what should be public, what should not be public, what should be hidden, what should be shadow, what should be in the light. So it's elements like that that start to creep in. What should you be embarrassed about? And that can be things like body parts or activities. What are you allowed to do in public? What should you do in private at home? But it can also be things like what it's okay to do because you're a woman, or what is it okay to do because you're a man, and equally what is it not okay to do because you're a woman, because you're a man, or because you're of a certain social class. Those people next door to common as muck, they can do that sort of thing, but we don't do that sort of thing, dear. We're far too posh to do that sort of thing. So it could be a social class thing. It could be a religious thing. That other religion over there, well, they go and eat pork chops, but we don't. We don't do that stuff. And woe betide you if anyone ever spots you having a bacon sarnie, because we don't do that. And it would bring shame upon the family if it were to be known in our religious community, in our synagogue, our mosque, or whatever, that you sneak off and have a bacon sarnie of a Wednesday afternoon. That would be shocking if the neighbours found out that you get up to that. So it could be a whole raft of things like that. You could, in some cultures, having premarital sex is shocking. In other cultures, it's not. In some cultures, being gay is shocking. In other cultures, it's not. So it's all sorts of things that you could learn that you have to hide about yourself. Hide the fact that you are upset and you want to cry, because people like you are not allowed to cry in that culture or in that family, or at least not in public. If you do cry, you go and lock yourself away and hope no one ever finds out that you've done it. there could be a whole raft of things that you are not allowed to do in public, and possibly you're not even meant to do in private. And so if you have those urges or impulses to do those things, you keep them hidden. So whilst Freud saw this as essentially very instinctual bodily impulses, which the baby learns to control as they get older and older, Jung said it is that, but it's also these other cultural things as well on top of it. That stuff you learn to do in the shadows, that if you do it at all. Maybe you don't, if you do it, you don't even admit to doing it. You don't want anyone else to know you do it. So you sort of hide that sort of thing away because it's considered shameful or dirty, or maybe it's simply private, or evil, wicked, awful, because the shadow incorporates everything from simply private all the way through to outright evil, wickedness, awfulness, and stuff you really wouldn't want the neighbours or the police or anyone else to know that you get up to, which is a big broad range of things. Now the idea of that, oh crikey, I'm rambling on a lot. The idea of the mood talk was to think about these ideas as they apply within paganism, because you obviously sort of mentioned examples of eating pork for Jewish people and Muslims and so on. You can apply this to any religion or to atheism or to anything else, but how does this apply peculiarly within paganism? One of the elements of the archetype is that whole communities have shadow sides. Things that they are embarrassed about or frightened by or fearful of or consider dangerous, dark, awful. Every light casts a shadow. And so you can look at any community, and a community could be the pagan community, which is the one I'll focus on. But equally, it could be a particular village, a particular town, a place where you're employed, a company, a business, a church, a culture. It could be at all sorts of levels of scale, from the very small to the vast. But we'll stick with the pagan community. The pagan community, like any other, has a shadow side. But that shadow side can be understood in two ways, a sort of a passive way and an active way. A passive way is that we often see, particularly if we are not spiritually mature, if we are struggling with psychological issues as individuals or as communities, and we cannot admit to our own shadow side. We don't like talking about it. We don't maybe even like acknowledging it to ourselves, let alone anyone else. It's a taboo subject. What happens when something is so taboo that you cannot admit to it in yourself? Admit to it in public or maybe even in private? Well, Jung said what you tend to start doing, and this is an idea he got from Freud, what you tend to start doing is projecting it. You tend to start seeing it in other people because it's there in you, and the more you kind of shove it down, the harder it pushes back up in the opposite direction. It refuses to be shoved underground for long. It's like locking a monster in the cellar. It doesn't die, it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger and tries to break the cellar door down. So you hear the banging on the cellar door and you think it's someone else. You don't want to admit that the monster is you. And so you see that monster in other people. And you can think of lots of examples in history where one group of people has become utterly convinced that another group of people are awful. They are lazy, they are stupid, they are greedy, they are dishonest, they'll nick anything that's not nailed down. Maybe they get up to all sorts of disgusting, filthy things. They may be unsanitary. They may have weird, perverted sexual appetites. They engage in crimes. They're just terrible, dreadful, awful people. History is filled with examples the world over of Group A convincing itself that Group B is the worst thing ever, and then taking steps. What are those steps? Well, generally speaking, you avoid Group B because they're disgusting, so you avoid them. Maybe if you bump into them in the street, you cross the road to the other side. Maybe if you've got any social power and clout, you start passing laws to kind of get rid of Group B and push them into the background, stop them having much influence in society and getting up to filthy things. Maybe if you are so high on that kind of bandwagon of power, you don't just have a few laws against them, you do your damnedest to stamp them out, to kill them, to get rid of them, to exterminate that group of people, to drive them away out of existence, or at least out of your country. And it can get very murderous, it can get very violent, it can get very brutal. And much as you have the idea from Nietzsche that if you stare into the abyss stares back into you, and you end up becoming the very monster you're trying to fight, you set out to kill the wicked people, and you start doing things in pursuit of putting an end to evil, which result in you becoming the evil one. You become the monster that murders and tortures and falsely imprisons and does awful, bloody, terrible things, all the while convinced that you're saintly and holy and lovely and they're the dreadful person, when actually you're the dreadful person. You become the monster. And that's part of Jung's argument, is that the more you try to repress an archetype, the more you'll become the archetype. You just won't be aware of it. You'll be very unself-aware, very clueless about the kind of person you're turning into. And so we think of examples that over the course of history, the conviction that in the early days when Christianity was becoming a prominent social force and establishing itself and getting bishops and archbishops and what have you, and establishing itself amongst the aristocracy and the royalty of Europe and other parts of the world, there was that sense that the pagans, the unbelievers, the unconverted, were a threat. And sometimes actually they were. Think of some of the activities carried out by late pagan emperors towards early Christians. They were quite dreadful, some of the things they got up to. But even when they weren't carrying out dreadful things, there was still that fear that they're pagans. They're not simply misusing political clout, they are getting up to disgusting things. Pagan orgies, all shop horrors, blood sacrifices and dreadful, dreadful things. The worst things you can imagine, that's what them lot get up to. And then as the centuries roll past, paganism as a sort of widespread religion diminishes and diminishes and diminishes down until there's very little left of it at all. But the fear doesn't go away. The fear of what them lot are getting up to doesn't go away. What happens is it starts to change language. And I don't mean it, they go from speaking French to speaking German, but rather they go from talking about the pagan emperors and the pagan high priests and high priestesses of the temples, because they're all dead by this point in time. What they start talking about instead are the witches. Now, Wicca, as it's understood in the modern world, only goes back a few decades. When the Inquisition was talking about blasphemers and people in league with the devil, back in the sort of 12th century, in those various periods of history, they weren't thinking about people worshipping goddesses and so forth in quite the way that we understand it in the modern sense. They were imagining more your Dennis Wheatley type stuff. They were imagining people in league with the devil who just thought they were worshipping goddesses. They were just deluded half-wits who didn't know any better, and nonetheless, although they needed kind of salvation and curing, if you couldn't save them, then the next best thing to do was just get shot of them by the most terminal means going. And so you start to get these fears emerging, again, as the centuries roll past, and it starts to shift, excuse me, outside of Catholicism to also incorporate Protestantism as the Protestant schisms were happening. And then Protestants start getting as worried about witches as the Catholics had been worried about witches earlier. Again, they're thinking at that point in time, they're not thinking Wicca and as we understand it, they're thinking devil worshippers. this notion that these usually toothless old women on the edges of villages, and occasionally men, occasionally younger people, were in league with dark forces and getting up to wicked things. And it's fairly obvious from reading through the trial records these days that these were just the wrong people in the wrong place, that they weren't getting up to much of anything. Their face didn't fit, they fell foul of some village feud, and so going witch was a good way of having that person you didn't like bumped off, because you didn't have to offer an awful lot of evidence to get a conviction. But the fear of people with magic powers, the fear of people with abilities, this notion of the witch as a very negative archetype, really comes to the fore. And from a Jungian point of view, what people are fearing is not based on actual evidence. They're not actually seeing people sitting there putting pins in dollars and cursing their cows. They're imagining stuff that's happening. Things that happen at night when they can't say, oh, what's that old woman getting up to, when we can't see what she's getting up to. And so they imagine stuff, they project, they fantasize, they put their own resentments, their own fears, their own hates, their own anxieties out onto these so-called witches, and then go and arrest them, torture them, imprison them, hang them. In other parts of the world, burn them at the stake. They go and do dreadful things to them. They become the monster they're trying to stamp out. Into modern times, 20th, 21st century, obviously we're not going around in this country burning people at the stake or hanging them for witchcraft. In parts of Africa, there are still witch trials fairly regularly, with the same kinds of fears and anxieties developing, and sometimes within the immigrant communities over here, occasionally you get a case fear of child witches, and people tormenting, torturing, killing their own children or a neighbour's child, because they think that child is a witch in league with monstrous forces and able to put curses and hexes and so on people. So again, it's this fear of dark power. Now, we could say that Jung argues that there are four main personality types. I've mentioned them in a previous podcast, one of which is the thinking type personality, the person who's sort of quite rational, quite logical, quite sensible, quite intellectual, who plans ahead, thinks, organises. Rather than being very emotional, they're very thought-oriented. Doesn't guarantee they'll be super-duper clever intellectual, but they're more inclined to use their mind and thought processes. There is a dark side to that, a shadow side to that. The shadow side of the thinking function is the manipulative person, the cunning individual who abuses their intellectual abilities to manipulate others who are not quite as on the ball as they are. And that can extend into a fear of people misusing their cleverness. And so the archetype of the dark witch or the dark wizard, the person who knows how to do stuff and is misusing those powers to hurt, to maim, to get up to secretive, furtive, conspiratorial behaviours, meeting in secret enclaves and all the rest. And you think about a lot of the paranoid conspiracy theories that the internet is knee-deep in are to do with furtive groups of people with clever agendas and plans and the most spectacularly convoluted schemes that they're getting up to. They may no longer be talking of witches, but there's still a lot of that fear of people misusing their cleverness, of scheming, plotting, planning, Machiavellian type characters. And so it's that dark side of the thinking archetype, what they're seeing in others. And the polar opposite to the thinking archetype is the feeling archetype, someone who's intensely emotional, who doesn't rationalise things out, but has gut reactions, very intense, emotive reactions. They, whether it's of love or of hate or what have you, very strong emotional forces that bypass rationality and logic. And so you can say a lot of the people doing the accusing, pointing the finger, going, "Oh, it's you! You're in league with the devil. You're one of the lizard people. You're this. You're that. You're the other." Are very, very emotional. So they're high on the feeling side and, if you like, low on the thinking function. And so the thinking function is pushed into shadow, is pushed into darkness. And so they become very mistrustful of historians, of doctors, of scientists, thinking in modern conspiracy theory rather than witch hunting, of anyone who is seen as an intellectual in some capacity. But even if we crank it back quite a few centuries, in Catholic Europe, going back a few centuries now, midwives were outlawed. There was this perception that midwives were helping women to have easy births, and that the curse of Eve was that women should suffer childbirth and period pains and all the rest of it, and not be kind of helped out of it. Therefore, any woman, or indeed for that matter, a male doctor, let alone anyone who was using their knowledge of herbs and medicine to make women's lives easier was in league with dark forces. They were misusing their knowledge to an evil agenda. So it's not quite on the same par as people who are convinced that, you know, vaccinations are a monstrous satanic conspiracy in this day and age. But that's still that fear that those clever buggers over there, we don't really, they know all about herbs and about medicine, all they're a bit too clever for their own good. They must be misusing that cleverness to some sinister, convoluted Machiavellian end. So there's a sort of an echo, if you like, between the fears of centuries past and the fears of the 21st century. Very emotionally fueled and fearful of what, if you like, is the shadow side of the thinking function. And so people who identify as pagan, whether they identify as witches or druids or heathens or any other of the variations going, you could argue are putting themselves in the firing line at risk of Joe Public projecting their hang-ups about what they think pagans are like. Whether they think pagans are using the dark forces to scary ends, or whether they just think pagans are always having orgies, chance of being burned, or they even just think that pagans are all tree-hugging hippies who are no bloody use to anyone. Nonetheless, you kind of put yourself in the line of other people's projections and hang-ups, and that's something, of course, to be conscious of when it comes to what is sometimes referred to as coming out of the broom closet. Do you tell other people you're pagan, or wear jewellery or have big slogans on your t-shirt or whatever that make your religious allegiances obvious? Because if you do, then a potential consequence is that other people will assume very grim things about you. It's their problem, you could say, to a large extent, their hang-ups, after all, but you are the one who's going to have to live with where their hang-ups lead them, what their hang-ups lead them to do. So whether or not it's their problem, in that sense, yes it is, but it's going to impact you in some way, shape, form or another. Whether that's them just keeping a wary eye on you and deciding they won't ask you to babysit in case you eat their kids, or whether that is, which is a good thing actually, not having to babysit, or whether that's them making complaints to your employer because they think you're up to no good, or some other bricking your window or something of that sort. There is the risk of having to live with other people's paranoias, other people's projections of the shadow, their shadow. And that's just something to think about. It's not to say you should all live in secrecy and never be open about your beliefs. I am. But it's a choice you should make with conscious awareness that it comes with a risk. And you might one day have to pay a higher price than you want to pay for that choice to live openly. So that's the more kind of passive side of the shadow, that you become a screen on which other people project their shadow. The more active side is that the pagan community itself, internal to itself, get the rest of the world, internal to itself, has its own shadow side. Of course it does, every community does. That's Jung's argument. So what is the shadow side of the pagan community? well, there's probably several. We could sit and list a few if we were so inclined to think about it. But one thing I mentioned briefly in that previous podcast, which is I think worth mentioning again, maybe in a little bit more depth, is that the pagan communities, Wiccan, Druid, Heathen, Kemetic, all the rest of them, are somewhat notorious amongst ourselves. I don't think the wider world has tweeted this yet, or much cares if it does. Um, but for feuding, witch wars, punch-ups between rival groups or rival individuals, who shouldn't even be rivals in the first place, but become rivals because there is perceived competition. I've been for a few myself, and heard about others from second-hand accounts and happening in other parts of the world or other parts of this country. Um, and it is alarmingly frequent. There was or is rather, a pagan writer called Margot Adler who carried out a series of studies in America, and she determined that the average life expectancy of a pagan group in America, when she carried out her studies, was about 18 months before it all bust up with feuds and handbag waving and accusations and people going off in huffs and the rest of it. Now, you could argue, well, that was a few years ago, maybe we've improved, and maybe in other parts of the world it's a bit longer. The Druid group I belong to is well over 20 years old now, so it's certainly not true for every group. But a lot of groups do break up, and they break up badly. It's not just that people move house and lose touch, it's that they have screaming bitch fits and accuse each other of dreadful things and stomp off in huffs, bosoms heaving, clutching their handbags and swinging their pearls as they go. And that's just the men. It's a recurrent problem. How can we understand this from a Jungian point of view? Well, having mentioned the dark side of the thinking function, another of the four personality types is the sensation function, which is very earthy, very pragmatic, and is the builder, if you like, the one who just gets on and does all the useful practical things. So there's the thinking function sitting over there, stroking their beard and having very grand thoughts that are all a bit pie in the sky. The sensation function gets on and does stuff. It's practical, organised, structured, down to earth. They make good bank managers as well as plumbers and electricians and builders because they're very hands-on type people. One thing they're good at is structure, and structure often involves hierarchy, organisation, management. The dark side of that is, shall we say, over-management, tyranny, becoming obsessed with power and who controls what and where and how, and territorialism, and other things as well, like leaden bureaucracy. But you don't get much bureaucracy in pagan groups, but you certainly do get people who are tin pot tyrants who want to be the great grand archdruid or the high priestess or the grand high wizard of this, that and the other, and give themselves very silly titles and wear tea-cozies on their head and have really big wands and flounce around with egos the size of Mount Everest and expect other people to bow down before them and treat them as the great grand high what's-it that they clearly think they are, in their own head at least. Which is not to say this is only confined to paganism, because you can look at lots of religions that have egomaniacs in them. It's not an uncommon thing. But you could make the argument, in fact I'm going to make the argument, that because paganism is a disorganised religion or an unregulated set of religions, whereas if you want to become an egomaniacal Catholic bishop, you've got to work your way up the system. You can't just pretend to be a bishop. You've got to work into the system that there is within the various forms of paganism. There are some organised groups, but by and large, it's deregulated. So anyone can read a book on paganism today and tomorrow declare themselves to be the great grand high priestess of this or the archdruid of that. And it's not as if there's a membership list where you can look them up and go, no, you're not. Whereas if somebody claims to be a Jewish rabbi or a Anglican bishop, there are lists. You can look it up and find out if they are what they claim to be. And so you can turn around and say to somebody, say, no, you're not. You're crackers. You're making it up. You are not what you claim to be. Whereas within paganism, if I want to say I'm the great high priest of Atlantis, well, I'm not the first to say that, won't be the last. And who, as such, is there to disagree? Because they can't point to a membership list and say, well, your name's not on the list, therefore you cannot be what you claim to be. It's the kind of religious movement that has a lot of emphasis on sort of revelatory experience and intuitive experience, which is the polar side of the sensation function, is the intuitive function. People having visions, self-revelation. I feel I am a druid, I feel I am a witch, I feel I am this, I feel I am that, and not requiring much external validation beyond the fact that they feel they are that thing. And maybe other people go, yeah, you feel like a shaman, you feel like a gotai, you feel like this, you feel like that, and going along with that. Not because they have certificates on the wall from an approved seminary training college, not because they can recite the runes backwards, not because they can speak ancient Greek or do this, do that, do that. They don't necessarily have to pass any particular trials or tests to make a claim that they are something and have that claim believed or defended, including by random strangers on the net who say, well, how very dare you suggest that Gladys is not the Grand High Priestess of Atlantis. If she thinks she's the Grand High Priestess of Atlantis, why don't you accept it, you judgmental knob, if you so dare to challenge Gladys's claim? And so what you get is a fair number of people making grand claims. And of course, if you're going to make a grand claim of being this great figure, well, part of being a great figure is having people follow you, is having minions who go and min when you tell them to min. And so there is an appeal to people who like to flounce and lord it or lady it over other people. Particularly maybe ones who don't want to have to put in a lot of effort by joining a more structured religion where they'd have to clamber up a slippery slope and do lots of study and lots of this, that and the other. Whereas within the pagan religions, you can pretty much go from reading the book on Monday to making grand pronunciations about who and what you are on Tuesday. So that the dark side is that sort of misuse of authority, that lording it over people, the claiming to have hierarchical status based on nothing more than your own egotistical delusions, and expecting other people to kowtow and getting very, very shirty when they don't. And with that comes the kind of territorial warfare. Oh, you stole my coven member, or oh, how very dare you teach ancient mystic crystal magic for half the price that I teach ancient mystic crystal magic for, and all that sort of palaver goes on. And so there's a lot of that sort of feuding and shenanigans within the pagan community, which I'd argue, whereas the projected side, the more passive side, how the kind of anxieties that some other people have about pagans is more connected to the dark side of the thinking function, and that sort of witch, wizard, sinister force archetype of the manipulator, the trickster figure. The dark side within is more the sensation function, the misuse of hierarchy and power and structure, and the kind of exploitation that goes with it, ripping people off for money or sexually exploiting them, what have you. Which archetypally you can say links into the idea of the king or the queen, which itself is really just a politicized form of the great mother, the great father. The authority figure, the primal authority figure is the parent, and that then becomes formalized in politics and religion and so on to kings and queens and lords and ladies and bishops and archbishops and the rest of it. So that sort of paternal or maternal structural figure. I could risk 1,000 irate emails by getting into the differences between the maternal, the queen figure, and the paternal, the king figure, as to the sort of the dark sides of the misuse of female power compared to the misuse of male power, shall we say feminine versus masculine, because these things aren't wholly channeled down purely biological lines. They kind of go in more subtle directions than that, but I suspect that's more hassle than it's worth to go into that one, because people get terribly upset about such things these days. So we'll sort of skip on a little bit and talk about the last section, which was the idea of, which we didn't really touch on very much in that previous video, it's kind of slightly towards the end, the idea of working with the shadow and how we can understand this as a Jungian practice within paganism. Different ways we can approach this. One is at a celebratory level, a festival level. We all, with the various different denominations within the sort of pagan umbrella, have a series of festivals during the course of the year, celebrating sometimes natural things like summer and winter and spring and so on, and sometimes celebrating historical events or celebrating other aspects of existence. In the northern hemisphere, obviously winter is the dark season, the cold season, and there are festivals geared to the beginning of winter, the middle of winter, the end of winter, and so on. Within most pagan traditions, there is some sort of, at least the ones based in the northern hemisphere, there is a set of festivals around the winter seasons, and so you could take the element of shadow quite literally, shadow, darkness, the dark part of the year, and gear some of those festivals not only to celebrating the darkness out there, the coming winter, the coldness, the snows, the blizzards and the rest of it, but also the darkness in here, the sort of internal darkness. And maybe celebrating isn't quite the right word, but understanding. Taking time in ritual, or kind of even outside of ritual during that period of the year, to sit and think about your own shadow side. Bits of yourself you don't like, bits of yourself you're embarrassed by, bits of yourself you keep very private and under wraps, and perhaps most important of all, those bits of yourself that you struggle to admit are even there in the first place, where it's not just hiding it from other people, it's the stuff you hide from yourself. Which isn't to say that the goal of the festival is to bring it all out into public, because that could have some really dodgy consequences, but rather to bring it to the fore of your own consciousness. So it doesn't really matter if other people know about things or not in that sense. It's not about telling them. It's about you understanding yourself and thinking, well, actually, yes, this is what I like. I do have a really bad temper. I do drink too much. I do this. I do that. What the hell am I going to do about this now? And it may be that some of the things you come to terms with, and some of the things you work on changing or improving, and some of the things you kind of hit your head against a brick wall and think, well, maybe next year I'll come up with a solution to this, but for the time being I'm going to have to live with it. How you address the darkness within, which can include also horrible memories of things that have happened to you in the past, things that have been done to you, or really shitty, awful things you've done to other people. And you might want to think about how you address those other people, assuming they're still around. Do you try and make amends to them, apologise to them, patch it up with them? If they want you to, they might tell you to sling your hook. Do you, in the very least, learn not to cause that kind of harm to anyone else in the future? Do you learn how to deal with situations where other people are trying to cause harm to you, so that maybe you respond to those situations differently in the future than you have done in the past, to better protect yourself, for example? So you could take that sort of seasonal approach. There is, talking too much, yeah, that's my dark side, talk too bloody much. An interesting festival within the ancient Greek calendar. There's a festival that lasts over several days called the Thesmothoria, which was a festival for women only, a goddess-oriented festival. And each day of the Thesmophoria is called something different and has a slightly different focus in terms of what to do. And there is a particular part of the festival where some historians argue it's on the day called Stenia, and others argue it was on the day called Kalaginea. So slightly different interpretations to which day of the Thesmophoria it was held on, but whichever day it was held on. It's a festival in which women come together and they get quite drunk. They meet up outside the town, so they're off, up in the woods, up the hills, leaving everyone else in peace, and they go off and they get a few sheets to the wind. And it's a festival of kind of venting spleen and venting darkness and shouting rude things to each other. Now, what's not clear is how honest people were, because you've got examples from other cultures. For example, in Scandinavian cultures, Norse cultures, examples of flyting, which is a sort of ritualized insult contest. And I've seen modern day versions of this within, what was it, rap. Not that I know bugger all about rap. I'm quite happy to know bugger all about rap. But I've seen rap contests between people where there's two of them, and one of them will sing a rap insult at the other one. Your mama's so fat, blah blah blah, and then the other one will come back with a riposte, and it kind of goes on and on and on until the audience cheers louder for one side than the other, and that side is declared the winner, or the other side runs out of insults and just sits in the corner and cries or something. But it's done slightly tongue-in-cheek, which is the point I'm coming to. We don't quite know whether this ancient Greek festival was tongue-in-cheek. So when the women were shouting insults at each other, was it in a slightly ha-ha, funny fashion? Or were they really sort of, letting rip and calling each other every name under the sun and really kind of putting the boot in? Because I can imagine that the humorous version you could laugh off at the end of the day. The festival's over and you go back to being friends again. But if you've been through a festival and someone's told you are the biggest arsehole they ever met in their life, and they mean it, what do you do when the festival ends? I mean, how do you handle that one? I don't know. So, but it's an interesting idea, isn't it, that whether it's an all-female or an all-male or a mixed or whatever it may be, to have a ritual where you're sort of venting the dark side, but you might really want to have a think about before you do it. Do you want to do it in a funny ha-ha way, or do you want to do it all guns blazing, raw emotion, which could potentially be quite abusive and hurtful, and people needing trauma counselling after it's all over? But the idea of letting, or like the example from the Japanese factories where they go into a little room and bash the figurine with a kendo stick, it's a ritualized letting off of steam. Maybe if you don't, you might already do something like this in your ritual year anyway, but if you don't, to think about, would it be worth including something like that? I've heard of people doing these, I'm not sure if adventure room is the right term, probably isn't, but they have like a room and there's plates and cups and old pianos and Lord knows what, and you pay your entrance fee, and they give you a sledgehammer, and in you go and you spend half an hour smashing things to smithereens, and you come out feeling so much better at the end of it. So it's that kind of, everyone has anger, everyone has frustrations, stuff that happens in their life that pees them off, and very often, especially in this country, because we're terribly British and we don't like saying anything, just tut at each other. It festers, and this is Jung's point. If you bottle it up, it will fester and get worse, not better. Therefore, you need to confront the darkness. However you do it, you need to confront the darkness to let it go in order to, like the steam valve, in order to reduce the pressure. So a ritualistic way of doing that, once a year or however often, of going and addressing that, something to consider. You could argue some festivals, again the dark side ones, we've got coming up within my own particular brand of paganism, the Feast of Samhain, which marks the start of winter in a couple of months' time, but is also the Festival of the Dead, in which we think about our ancestors and people who have died in the previous 12 months, and pets and what have you have died in the previous 12 months. And of course, that part of that thinking about the dead is the memento mori. Remember, you too must die, because one day someone will be remembering me. Well, I hope they will be remembering them. I might be forgotten about entirely within 5 minutes of being cold, but um, there might be someone in the future who's sitting there drinking a toast of mead and thinking hopefully nice thoughts about me. When I've shuffled off my mortal coil, I mean, they might be thinking I'm the biggest twat they ever met, but hopefully they'll be thinking nice thoughts about me. And it's part of that memento mori is to confront your own death. Know that your days are numbered. I mean, even if I live to be 90, that's still a number. And one day those days will run out. And so you don't want to be on your deathbed thinking, if only I had done X, Y, and Z. Missed me chance, too late now. Rather, get to your deathbed thinking, I did all of the things I wanted to do. Woo! And off you go. So, what have you left undone? What haven't you said, haven't done that you really want to do before your time is up? And you never know when your time is up. It could be dead tomorrow, you don't know. It could be dead this evening. So it's thinking about getting stuff done before you run out of time. Living your life passionately before you run out of time. Could, as a slight variation on this, say the same of other relationships, memento mori. The people in your life at the moment who are alive, you don't know how long they're going to remain alive for. The loved ones, will they be alive tomorrow, next week, next month, next year? You don't know, I don't know. And so it's about making the most of those living friends, relatives, what have you, whilst they're around. Don't wait until you're at the gravesite to say nice things about them. Say nice things about them to their face when they're alive, and they go, thank you very much. You cared. Or don't leave it too late. That's part of that memento mori. And not just within my tradition, most pagan traditions have some kind of festival of the dead at some point in the year where they're engaging in these thought processes, and the shadow is at least partially the shadow of death. The other variant angle is not so much memento mori, which is a traditional Latin phrase if you've never heard it before, but what I might innovate, a cod Latin phrase of memento infirmi. Infirmis, where we get the word infirm, frail, doddery from. That remember, not only will you one day die, but one day you might be quite frail. So even if you're in good health today and running around and able to do 1,000,001 things, as you get older, you start to notice that things you could do very easily 10 years ago, you now ache and do slowly and take a week to recover from afterwards. And so do I know, I was going to say 10 years from now, do I know 10 days from now? Because stuff happens, people have strokes, they have heart attacks, not just the frailty of being very, very old, because frailty can come at any age. You could be 20 and in a car accident that leaves you very, very frail and physically struggling to do things, or mentally struggling to do things, which I think is even more disturbing, really, in a world where more and more people get Alzheimer's and dementia and so on. The loss of mind is much more frightening than the loss of bodily ability. And so it's about making the most of what you can do whilst you can do it, because there are no guarantees you'll still be able to do it tomorrow, let alone in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years time. So it's that kind of live in the moment, do it whilst you can do it approach, which is not an injunction to do horrible things to other people, but to enjoy life whilst you can enjoy it before it becomes too difficult to enjoy it. And that again, confronting infirmity, physical weakness, mental weakness, is part of the shadow. The thought, and there's all sorts of arguments we could drag in, Judith Butler and 101 other people, ideas that often people get very antsy around seeing the people who are very old, very frail, very disabled, people who are clearly suffering in some way or another, because it's a reminder of what they themselves might one day experience. And if you haven't come to terms with your own fear of possible illness, possible death, possible suffering, then witnessing the suffering of somebody else can be frightening. And so it's too easy, if you're frightened, just to pull away from that person, pretend you can't see them, don't look at them, which is quite hurtful for them, usually, because you haven't confronted your own potential frailties in that area of what might happen to you tomorrow or 20 years' time or whenever it's going to happen, if it happens. So those kind of ritualistic reflections and approaching the darkness, approaching your own shadow in the various different ways that the shadow can be understood. The last bit I'll do very quickly because I've gone way over the amount of time I was planning to talk about this stuff. We have gods, goddesses, deities, spirits of one shape, size, form or another. Not all of whom are cuddly and lovely and fluffy. Some of them are quite frightening and quite scary, the way they're described in myth, and the way people have direct spiritual experience, revelatory experiences often can be really quite scary. Deities associated with death, with illness, with vulnerability. Deities of winter, deities of the night, deities linked to animals that might scare them. If you're scared to death of spiders, there are gods and goddesses associated with spiders, with all sorts of other creatures that you might have some phobia or hang up about. So gods associated either overtly with fear in the more general sense, or with some fear that is perhaps more peculiar to you, like a fear of a particular animal that most other people may not have. And so part of the shadow can be, say, working with, approaching a deity, prayer, ritual, meditation, etc., conversation. A deity who governs some area of existence which scares the crap out of you, and getting to know them, which doesn't guarantee you'll get to love them and it will be smashing and cuddly and a big therapy huggy session. You might still be quite scared of them at the end of it, but at least you are starting to approach your own fears and worries and your own shadow and your own darkness. Or if it's the case that horrible things were done to you at some point in your life, then deities linked with healing, that the healing journey of coming to terms with those awful memories. Or if you were the person who did the horrible things, or both, maybe you were both victim and perpetrator at different points in your life. If you've done vile things to other people, deities associated with justice, so thinking about, I've really hurt that person, what can I do to put it right? What can I do to change my behaviour? And so the meditation, the prayer, the conversation, that whole process, communication with deity isn't simply a form of therapy. I don't want to put it across as that, because there's too many people who go into all sorts of religions to try and sort their own hang-ups out, and that's sort of where it ends, which I think is missing half the point of any of these religions. It's not just about therapy, there's more to it than that, but it is, the healing process is a significant part of it, even if it's not the end all and be all of it, and it's about addressing the darkness within you by communicating with a darkness that incorporates you but is also much bigger than you and goes beyond you. Especially if you are a person, you're a polytheist as I am perhaps, who believes in the primal nature of many deities as pre-existing the human condition, rather than being purely archetypal figments of the human mind. But some, at least, of those forces have been there a bloody sight longer than we have, and engaged not just with human beings, but with a whole raft of other living beings as well, who also have their own darkness and pain and suffering and so forth. So some of these forces are ancient, and the scale of time itself can be quite frightening, quite sort of overwhelming. And so that sort of ritual, sitting in a darkened room perhaps, in silence, or sitting out in the woods at night, or on top of a mountain, and health and safety, don't fall off. But going wherever you want to go in, and experiencing darkness, experiencing the sounds of the night, which can set off all those primal small furry animal anxieties we have in the back of our evolutionary brain as to what the hell those weird creepy noises in the night actually are. It's something coming to eat us. can help to address those shadows within. And the aim is not to reach a point where you're all radiant light without a single shadow. I know that's an emphasis in some religions, is to become the light. But I'd say within the pagan religions, the goal is to attain a degree of consciousness. So there may be parts of you still in shadow, and there's nothing wrong with that, because the world is a combination of light and dark. Always has been, always will be. And so it's not about eliminating the dark, it's about coming to terms with the dark. It's about seeing the benefits of the dark, seeing the gains, the advantages, the insights, the wisdoms, the understandings, the freedom of the darkness, of the shadows, that can transform it, which is back to the Jung's idea that it's not all about primal rage and angst. It can be about a whole raft of quite ordinary things that have been shoved into the back of your own mental cupboard, hidden in darkness. Sure, maybe I should say cellar rather than cupboard, that's a bit more graphic, isn't it? Pushed away because you, or the culture you've brought up in, or even just the family you've been brought up in, doesn't like that sort of thing. But that doesn't mean that sort of thing is de facto bad. There may be good sides to it. That said, there are things in life which are clearly difficult to redeem. The extreme sadism, paedophilia, stuff like that, which is very difficult to see any kind of redemptive factor to. So maybe in those cases it's more about healing the damage caused than it is about finding the silver lining in the dark storm cloud. Finding some form of resolution to the pain that has been carved into your psyche. That's a very dark note to end on, isn't it? Never mind. I've gone on way too long, so I will end here. If anyone's got any questions, you ask. Or indeed you can sort of share experiences perhaps, or if you think I'm wrong on certain things and you have a better take on it, but you're interested to hear a better take. But here's just ways in which we can understand the shadow within modern paganism and the kind of ways to view it, to grasp it, to understand it.